So as far as background about why I'm here, I'll tell you guys the little story of how I met Nancy. So I was doing a show at Ensemble Theater, The Legend of Georgia McBride. And in that show, afterwards, we had a Q&A, a question and answer session. And during that question and answer session, someone asked about, how do we do that? How do we get on stage and we perform? And is it terrifying? Is it scary? And immediately I shared with them that in the script, there is not so I have this huge scene, this sort of come to Jesus scene. And right after that, I have to do this dance. And by the way, a little background, I was playing a drag queen in the show, and so I had to do a drag number. And what was terrifying about that more than anything is not so much the expectation that others have on me, but the expectations I put on myself. And a lot of times after that number, I would have these panic attacks backstage. And it took a lot of breathing and water to sort of come to terms and balance with myself. And I shared that during this question and answer session. And it was Jenny Ferguson who, after the question and answer session, reached out to me and said, "Hey, I love that you shared this story. And I was wondering if you'd be interested in meeting with me and Nancy Miller and talking more about this." And I met with them, and here I am today. So there's that. Now, a little background about me. So I'm originally from St. Martinville, Louisiana, which is this little nugget little town in really, really South Louisiana, Cajun country, as they call it, Acadiana. And my mom and dad, they separated when I was 3. And when that separation happened, there was a lot of changes that started going on with me. Whether or not they were connected to the divorce, I'm not really sure. But ultimately, I sort of crawled into a shell. And my mom had a really hard time dealing with that. And one of the things that immediately had to happen is I moved in with my grandmother because my mom just didn't know how to manage it. I would have these night terrors. I wet the bed until I was 13. Anytime we were at a family function, I would completely remove myself and withdraw. And if I was in any way pulled to try and connect with other people, ultimately what it ended up being, and I learned this later, I would have panic attacks. So my grandmother took me in, and my grandmother, she passed away in 2008, but that woman to this day is probably the most amazing person I've ever met in my life and experienced. She was not a gentle person. She was stern, but she had a heart of gold. It always came from such a warm place. And she was the only person who was able to calm me down when I would go into a panic attack. So I lived with her until I was 13 years old. Now, when I was 11 years old, that's when I had a sort of awakening, a realization. I remember sitting on the playground, not playing, on the playground. And the boys were on one side, the girls were on another side. Let me let you guess what side I was on. I was on the side with the girls. And while sitting on the side with the girls, I had this weird out-of-body experience where I remember just looking at the boys on the other side and realizing I'm not where I'm supposed to be. And in that moment, whether I knew the words or not, I knew I was different. I knew there was something going on. And that's when definitely things propelled even further into my withdrawal and confusion and these horrible panic attacks. Well, about 3 months after that experience happened, a worse experience happened. So, anybody remember the game? The kids used to play this. I don't know if they still play this today, but it's called Bloody Mary. Yeah. Well, ultimately, for those who don't know, what happens is that you go in front of a mirror, you turn the lights off, and you're supposed to say her name 3 times. It's like folklore. It's kind of like superstition. And she's supposed to appear and kill you or something, right? So I had to go to the restroom really badly, and the boys were playing that in the restroom. So I get in there, and I was proud of myself, by the way. This is me in the 6th grade, 11 years old, and I'm bold for myself at that point. I went into the restroom despite all of them playing this game, and I immediately went to the stall, went to the restroom, locked the door. And while I was in there, all of a sudden, I heard all of them run out and leave. Well, I flushed the toilet, and I walked out of the stall, and from what my memory has given me, all I remember is a woman sitting there in a glowing rocking chair with her back facing me. And it terrified me. It absolutely terrified me. So all I could do is slide across the wall, get to the door. Once I get to the door, I'm noticing that all the kids are on the other side holding it shut and laughing at me. So immediately, I just start to cry and weep and sob and bang on the door and bang on the door. And then luckily, Saved by the bell rung. So once the bell rung, all the kids let go of the door and they started running off. I walk out of there, and immediately my first reaction is, don't let anybody see you have any emotion. Wipe the tears, calm down, get it together, get it together. And I remember walking into the classroom, and the teacher, Miss Bernard, she looked at me and she immediately was like, Darnell, what's wrong? What's wrong? What happened? And I thought she was just referring to my frantic state and my emotional state. And as it turns out, she was not. She said, your leg, what's going on with your leg? So on the left side of my leg, okay, anybody who grew up in the 80s or was in the 80s, you'll know this. I had on a pair of overall shorts that were acid wash, mind you. And they had a hole right there. They had a hole there. And in that hole, all you saw was blood running down the side of my leg. So immediately I was sent to the nurse's office, and they realized that the wound was a lot worse than she could manage. So I ultimately got cleaned up a little bit, and they rushed me to the hospital. I get to the hospital, and it turns out that there was, ultimately the wound was about 1.5 inches deep, and it was about 1 inch wide. Nobody knew what it was. All they said is that it looked like a stab wound. So after I gotten cleaned up, all of a sudden the police officers come in and they start asking me questions. What happened? Did you see anybody? Who did this to you? Why aren't you telling us? And of course, to a little anxiety-ridden kid, I immediately crawled into a shell and said, no, it was not a kid. I didn't want to tell them what I saw because at the end of the day, I was worried that they wouldn't believe me. So I didn't say anything. I just kept telling them nothing. I don't know. So what they did, they made this terrified kid walk into every single classroom at the school to identify the person who did it. I have never, even still at 33 years old, been more terrified than that moment in my life. And afterwards, when they realized that I wasn't identifying anybody, they suggested to my mom and to my grandmother that I start seeing the school counselor. So that starts the beginning of my journey to mental wellness. When I started seeing the counselor, a lot of things came up. The issues of feeling different and other, as I oftentimes call it. The issues of the complications of my mom and not feeling like she wanted me came up. A lot of different things came up. But at the end of it all, about 2 years later, when I was 13, that's when I officially got diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. And that's also the time when I stopped wetting the bed. That's also the time when I stopped having the night terrors as much. And that began a journey to me understanding things. I started getting medicated, and what started happening through the sessions, she noticed every single time that I had a breakthrough, it was when I was physical in some way or other. So she said, Darnell, movement is what you need to do. That will help balance you. So I eventually became a dancer. So that's when I joined a modern dance class, and I started taking dance lessons. And we noticed slowly but surely all the symptoms of removing myself started to go away. And from there, I took a speech class, and that speech class helped propel me even further. So here I am at this point. I'm about to graduate from high school, and the decision is, okay, well, what are you going to do? At that point, I'd become so fascinated with psychology that I thought, I'm going to go and I'm going to be a psychologist. I'm going to help others. Well, needless to say, that didn't happen. My mom and I got into a really bad argument, and out of spite, I changed my entire major, dropped all of my classes, and I decided I was going to go for performing arts. So, started college, and I got my undergraduate degree from University of Louisiana at Lafayette in performing arts because I had just as many dance credits as I had theater credits. From there, I realized, you know what? I'm not finished. There's more that needs to be done. So then I went to University of Houston, and I got my Master's of Fine Arts in Classical Theater Performance. That's when I somehow landed here in Cincinnati. I had an audition in Memphis that brought me here, and 7 years later, I'm still here. And the reason why this has become so much of a passion of mine, mental health, and being aware of it, is because oftentimes a lot of people think that being a performer, that it's so easy to just get up there and perform. For some people, it's the pressures of others. For me, it's always been the pressures I put on myself. I think some of that stems from my experience with my mom and my brother, for example. He lived with her throughout the entirety of my youth while I was living with my grandmother. So I always kind of felt like a sort of lack of love from her. So as a result, I've become this overachiever. So every single time I'm performing, I'm beating myself up for every little thing. And it's a constant struggle. And one thing I've never forgotten through all of that is movement has been the thing that's always gotten me through it. Movement, movement, movement. And as far as where I am today, I do a lot of activism work. For example, I do stuff with the Black Lives Matter Cincinnati chapter. I do stuff with a friend of mine started an organization called HIV at the Boss of Me, not to necessarily educate people so much as to fight the stigma. And also, I've done a lot of things with the kids in the community as far as like connecting with kids from lower socioeconomic areas in order to improve their confidence, to make them excited about learning. So it is so incredibly exciting to me to be here tonight and be able to talk about a new thing, to be able to connect with a new group of people about another passion of mine that I've actually never done before, about mental health awareness. So thanks so much for listening to my story.